April 5, 1242. Lake Peipus, on the border between Novgorod and the Livonian territories. When the spring thaw began 3 weeks after the battle, local fishermen made a discovery that would haunt the region for generations. Beneath the melting ice, they found something that shouldn't have been there. Hundreds of bodies, still clad in full armor, suspended in the frozen water like grotesque ornaments. But it wasn't the bodies themselves that terrified the fishermen. It was the positions they were frozen in. Hands clawing upward toward the surface, mouths open in silent screams. And something else. Scratch marks on the underside of the ice, deep gouges made by metal gauntlets, some over 30 feet from the nearest break in the surface. The official records state that Alexander Nevsky's forces defeated the Teutonic Knights in fair combat on the frozen lake. But the truth was far more terrifying. Before we uncover the truth about the battle on the ice and the drowning of Lake Peipus, where Alexander Nevsky's victory sent hundreds of armored cavalry through the frozen surface to a death more horrifying than any sword could deliver, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now let's descend into one of medieval history's most chilling mass casualties. The year 1242 marked a critical moment in the struggle for dominance over the Baltic region. The Teutonic Knights, a military order founded during the Crusades, had expanded their influence northward, establishing fortified positions throughout what is now Estonia and Latvia. These weren't mere soldiers. They were the military elite of Christian Europe, heavily armored cavalry trained from childhood in the art of war, convinced of their divine right to conquer and convert the indigenous populations by force. The Republic of Novgorod stood as the last major obstacle to their eastern expansion. This wealthy trading state, with its connections to both Byzantine and Scandinavian markets, represented everything the Teutonic Order sought to control. By early 1242, the Knights had already seized the strategic cities of Pskov and Izborsk, tightening their grip around Novgorod's throat. Alexander Yaroslavich, later known as Alexander Nevsky, was only 21 years old when he assumed command of Novgorod's defense. The son of Grand Prince Yaroslav II, Alexander had already proven himself 2 years earlier by defeating Swedish forces on the Neva River, earning his famous epithet. But the Teutonic Knights represented a far greater threat. They were better equipped, better trained, and backed by the political might of the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope himself. Lake Peipus itself was a massive body of water, stretching over 1,370 square miles along the border between Novgorod and the Livonian territories. In April, the lake would typically still be frozen, though the ice would be weakening as spring approached. Local fishermen knew the lake intimately. They understood which areas remained solid and which had begun to deteriorate under the warming sun. They knew where underground springs created thin patches, where the ice was deceptively fragile despite appearing solid. This knowledge would prove crucial. The Teutonic forces that marched toward this confrontation numbered between 2,000 to 4,000 men, including several hundred heavily armored knights, mounted on war horses themselves bearing armor that could weigh up to 100 pounds. Each knight wore full plate armor, weighing between 50 to 70 pounds, carried weapons, and rode horses bred for their size and strength. The total weight of a single mounted knight could exceed half a ton. Contemporary chronicles describe the knights' confidence as they advanced. They had never been defeated in open battle in this region. Their heavy cavalry charges had shattered every army that dared to face the. They expected this engagement to be no different, but Alexander Nevsky was planning something that had never been attempted before, something so audacious, so calculated, that even his own commanders questioned his sanity. He was going to turn Lake Peipus itself into a weapon. The first indication that something unusual was happening came on April 3rd, 2 days before the main battle. A Novgorodian reconnaissance unit reported back to Alexander with disturbing news. They had encountered a small Teutonic patrol near the lake's eastern shore. During the skirmish, one of the German horses had broken through the ice in a shallow area near the shore. The knight had managed to escape, but the horse, weighed down by its armor, had thrashed frantically before disappearing beneath the surface. What disturbed the Novgorodian scouts wasn't the incident itself. Horses occasionally broke through weak ice. It was the reaction of the Teutonic patrol leader. According to the eyewitness account preserved in the Novgorod Chronicle, the German commander had laughed, stating in broken Slavic, "The lake is still solid enough to bear God's army." Alexander reportedly studied this report for hours. consulting with local fishermen about the ice conditions. One elderly fisherman named Ratibor would later testify that the prince asked him repeatedly about a specific area of the lake, a section known locally as Voron Cayman or Raven Rock. This area, Ratibor explained, was treacherous even in the deepest winter. Underground springs kept the water moving beneath the ice, creating a thinner layer that could appear deceptively solid when covered with snow. The second incident occurred on the morning of April 4th. A merchant traveling from Pskov reported to the Novgorodian camp that he had witnessed Teutonic forces conducting training exercises on the frozen lake. The knights were practicing their famous wedge formation, the pig's snout or boar's head formation that had crushed so many enemies. The merchant described how the earth seemed to shake as hundreds of armored horsemen thundered across the ice in perfect formation. The ice groaned beneath them, the merchant testified. I could hear it from the shore, a deep sound like the lake itself was in pain, but the Germans, they didn't seem to notice, or perhaps they didn't care. Alexander's response to this report was peculiar. Rather than showing concern about the enemy's strength, he smiled. His chronicler noted that the prince immediately ordered his forces to begin preparations for battle, but not in the traditional sense. He commanded his men to gather branches, logs, and anything that could mark specific paths across the ice. The third escalation came that same evening. A defector from the Livonian forces, a Estonian conscript named Kaupo, arrived at the Novgorodian camp with critical intelligence. The Teutonic commander, Hermann von Buxhoeveden, had planned to launch his main assault the following day. The knights would advance in their traditional wedge formation, smash through the Russian center, and rout the enemy in a single devastating charge. But Kaupo shared something else, something that Alexander seized upon immediately. The Teutonic forces had been ordered to pursue any retreating Russians without mercy or hesitation. Hermann had declared that God's warriors do not pause when heretics flee before them. That night, Alexander assembled his commanders for what witnesses described as the strangest battle briefing they had ever attended. According to the Chronicle of Pskov, the prince spread out a crude map of the lake and marked several areas with stones. Here, he pointed to Voron Cayman, the lake is weak. The ice is less than half the thickness of the surrounding areas. It can bear men on foot. It might bear a few horsemen. But if hundreds of knights, fully armored, were to converge on this point simultaneously, he didn't need to finish the sentence. One of his commanders, a veteran named Domash Tverdislavich, protested immediately. My prince, what you're suggesting, it would be murder, not battle. These men would drown like rats in a barrel. Alexander's response, preserved in the official record, is chilling in its calculated precision. They come to slaughter us in the name of their God. We will let the lake judge who is righteous. The final incident before the battle occurred in the pre-dawn hours of April 5th. Novgorodian scouts reported that the Teutonic forces were assembling for their assault. The knights were donning their full armor, blessing their weapons, and mounting their war horses. The Bishop of Dorpat was moving through the ranks, offering absolution for the sins they would commit in the coming slaughter. No one on the German side seemed concerned about the ice. After all, it had borne their weight during training exercises. The lake had been frozen solid for months, and God, they believed, was on their side. They had no idea they were marching toward a tomb. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. What we're about to uncover is one of the most calculated uses of environmental warfare in medieval history. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happened when the Teutonic Knights charged onto Lake Peipus. April 5th, 1242. Dawn. The battle began conventionally enough. The Teutonic Knights assembled in their classic wedge formation, heavily armored cavalry at the front and center, with lighter infantry supporting the flanks. Contemporary sources estimate between 600 to 800 mounted knights participated in the initial charge, with an additional 1,200 to 2,000 infantry. Alexander had positioned his forces in what appeared to be a traditional defensive formation near the shore of the lake, with his center deliberately weakened. To the experienced Teutonic commanders, this looked like a tactical error, exactly the kind of mistake that would allow their wedge to break through and shatter the Russian army. At approximately 8 in the morning, the Teutonic charge began. The sound, witnesses reported, was like thunder. The ice beneath hundreds of armored horses vibrated with each synchronized step. The knights lowered their lances, their battle cry, Gott mit uns, God with us, echoing across the frozen lake. The Novgorodian center held briefly, then broke, according to plan. This is where Alexander's strategy revealed its horrific genius. The retreating Russian forces didn't scatter randomly. They fled along specific paths that had been marked the previous night, paths that led the pursuing knights toward Voron Cayman, toward the weakest ice on the entire lake. The Teutonic commanders, seeing their enemy in full retreat, ordered their men to pursue without hesitation. This was the moment they had trained for, the routing of the enemy, the complete destruction of resistance. Hermann von Buxhoevden himself led the charge, urging his knights forward, deeper onto the lake, toward the area where the ice was already groaning under the accumulated weight. The first crack, witnesses testified, sounded like a tree splitting in a storm. A knight near the front of the formation simply disappeared. One moment his horse was galloping forward, the next moment both horse and rider had plunged through the ice into the freezing water below. His companions barely had time to register what had happened before more sections of ice began to fail. What followed was chaos beyond comprehension. The ice didn't break uniformly. It shattered in sections, creating a deadly maze of solid ground and gaping holes. Knights who managed to rein in their horses watched in horror as their comrades vanished into the lake. The weight of their armor, which had protected them in countless battles, now became their executioner. A man in full plate armor cannot swim. Once submerged, he sinks immediately. But here's where the true horror emerged, the detail that haunts the historical record and would traumatize survivors for the rest of their lives. The water beneath the ice of Lake Peipus in early April is approximately 34 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, cold water shock occurs within seconds. The body's involuntary gasp reflex triggers immediately upon immersion, causing victims to inhale water. Hypothermia begins within minutes. But for the knights who went through the ice at Voron Cayman, there was an additional nightmare. They didn't fall into open water. They fell through holes in the ice, into the water beneath the frozen surface. The current beneath the ice, driven by those underground springs that made this area so treacherous, began immediately pulling them away from the holes through which they had fallen. In their heavy armor, unable to swim, they were carried by the current beneath the solid ice, away from any possible exit. Contemporary accounts describe men clawing at the underside of the ice, their metal gauntlets scratching desperately at the frozen barrier above them as they drowned. Some managed to punch through in places, creating small holes through which they tried to breathe, only to be pulled further by the current, their strength failing as the cold water invaded their armor and the weight dragged them down. A Novgorodian archer named Mikula, positioned on the shore, recorded what he saw. The ice was breaking like bread and the Germans were falling through, but worse were those we could see beneath the ice. Shadows moving under the surface, hands pressing up against it. Some places you could see their faces through the ice, mouths open, eyes wide. They were trying to scream, but there was only water. The Livonian rhymed chronicle, written by the Teutonic Order itself, admits to the horror. Many fell on the ice, which broke under them. The lake swallowed them, and they drowned in their armor like stones. Within 30 minutes, the battle on the ice was effectively over. Between 400 and 500 Teutonic Knights had perished, the vast majority not from combat wounds but from drowning. Hundreds more infantry died attempting to rescue their commanders or fleeing across unstable ice. The survivors retreated in complete disarray, abandoning their trapped comrades to their fate. But the discovery wasn't complete. The true scope of the horror wouldn't be revealed for weeks. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Alexander Nevsky and his forces returned to Novgorod as heroes. They had achieved what seemed impossible, defeating the elite Teutonic Knights, halting their eastern expansion and securing Novgorod's independence. The political ramifications were enormous. The Teutonic Order was forced to negotiate, returning all captured territory and abandoning their claims to Russian lands. But on Lake Peipus, something else was happening. The bodies of the drowned knights remained beneath the ice, held down by the weight of their armor, preserved in the freezing water. Local fishing communities avoided the area, claiming the lake was cursed and that they could hear screaming when the wind blew across the ice at night. Then, in late April, the spring thaw began in earnest. The fisherman who made the initial discovery was named Yakim. On April 26th, 3 weeks after the battle, he was checking his nets near the battle site when he noticed something dark beneath the thinning ice. At first he thought it was a submerged log. Then he saw the hand. Yakim immediately contacted the Orthodox priest in the nearby village of Talabsk. Father Theodore arrived with several witnesses, and what they found would be documented in church records that survive to this day. As the ice melted, the bodies of the Teutonic Knights began to emerge. But they didn't simply float to the surface. The weight of their armor kept many of them suspended in the water, creating a grotesque underwater tableau. Fishermen reported being able to see dozens of armored figures standing upright beneath the surface, as if frozen in time, their armor keeping them in a perpetual mockery of military formation. It was like looking into hell itself, Father Theodore wrote in his report to the Archbishop of Novgorod. The water was clear enough that we could see their faces. Some still had their eyes open. Their mouths were open as if still screaming, and around them their horses, also in armor, suspended in the water like statues. The recovery operation that followed revealed the full extent of the catastrophe and several details that complicated the historical narrative. First, the examination of the bodies showed that many knights had not drowned immediately. The positioning of their remains indicated they had survived the initial plunge through the ice and had attempted to escape. Investigators found that several knights had managed to remove parts of their armor while underwater, a desperate attempt to reduce weight and swim to safety. Gauntlets were found scattered across the lake bed. Some helmets showed dents from the inside, where knights had tried to bash their way through the ice above them. Most disturbing were the scratch marks, not just on the underside of the ice, which had melted, but on rocks and submerged logs. The drowning men had grabbed onto anything they could find beneath the surface, their metal gauntlets leaving deep gouges in the stone. Some of these marks can still be seen today by divers exploring the lake bed. Second, the investigation revealed the extent of Alexander's tactical preparation. Local villagers testified that Novgorodian scouts had spent days before the battle testing the ice thickness at various points on the lake. They had identified the weak areas and marked safe paths that avoided them. The retreat route that drew the Teutonic Knights to their doom had been carefully planned and rehearsed. This raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of the victory. Was this a legitimate military strategy or a war crime? The debate raged among chroniclers and church officials. The Teutonic Order, understandably, claimed it was murder by deception. In a formal complaint to the Pope, Grandmaster Heinrich von Hohenlohe wrote, "The Russian prince did not defeat our knights in honorable combat. He lured them onto weak ice with full knowledge that they would drown. This is not warfare but assassination by treachery." The Russian Orthodox Church conversely argued that Alexander had used the terrain to his advantage, a time-honored military strategy. Metropolitan Cyril of Novgorod declared, "God provided the frozen lake as a battlefield. Prince Alexander wisely used God's creation to defend the faithful against foreign invaders. The ice broke beneath the Germans because their cause was unjust." The recovery of the bodies presented its own challenges. Many knights, still in full armor, could only be retrieved by dragging them across the lake bed with hooks. The weight made normal recovery impossible. Some families from the Teutonic Order sent representatives to claim their dead, but many bodies were never identified. The Orthodox Church refused to allow the Germans to be buried in consecrated ground, considering them invaders and enemies of the faith. A mass grave was dug on the western shore of Lake Peipus. Between 300 and 400 bodies were interred there, still in their armor because removing it proved too difficult and time-consuming. No marker was placed. The Teutonic Order was not permitted to conduct Catholic burial rites. But the investigation also revealed something that would be suppressed in official Russian histories for centuries. Not all of the drowning victims were Teutonic Knights. Among the recovered bodies were those of Estonian and Livonian conscripts who had been forced to fight alongside the Knights. These were men who had no choice in the matter, pressed into service by their German overlords. They drowned just as horribly as their masters, trapped beneath the ice in lighter armor. It still proved heavy enough to doom them. Additionally, some evidence suggests that a small number of Novgorodian soldiers also perished in the ice breaks. The retreat that drew the Teutonic Knights into the trap was not without risk to the retreating forces themselves. Several Russian chroniclers mention casualties from drowning, though these are minimized in official accounts that prefer to present the battle as a flawless victory. The psychological aftermath among survivors on both sides was profound. Livonian sources describe Teutonic Knights who survived the battle suffering from what we would now recognize as severe trauma. One account describes a knight named Dietrich von Gruningen, who returned to his commandery but could no longer bear to be near water. He refused to cross rivers, would not bathe, and eventually had to be confined when he became violent at the sight of ice. Among the Novgorodian forces, there were also deep psychological scars, though these are less documented. Some soldiers reportedly struggled with guilt over the manner of the victory. Mikula, the archer who had witnessed men drowning beneath the ice, entered a monastery shortly after the battle, and refused to ever speak of what he had seen. The legal proceedings that followed were equally complex. The Teutonic Order demanded compensation and punishment for what they termed Alexander's massacre. The Pope sent envoys to investigate. However, the political reality was that Novgorod had won a decisive military victory, and the Teutonic Order was in no position to demand justice. The Treaty of Stensby in 1242 officially ended the conflict. The Teutonic Order agreed to abandon all claims to Russian territory and pay reparations to Novgorod. In exchange, Alexander agreed not to press his advantage by launching a counter-invasion of Livonian territories. Neither side formally addressed the controversial nature of the battle itself. One final element of the aftermath deserves mention. In the years following the battle, Lake Peipus became a place of dark pilgrimage. Local legends emerged about the lake being haunted by the ghosts of the drowned knights. Fishermen reported seeing armored figures walking beneath the ice during winter. Swimmers in summer claimed to feel hands grabbing at their legs. Whether these accounts represent genuine supernatural beliefs or simply the traumatic psychological imprint of the massacre on the local collective consciousness remains debatable. What is not debatable is that the lake's reputation was permanently altered. For generations, locals avoided the area around Voron-Kamenn, particularly in winter. The battle on the ice fundamentally changed the course of Eastern European history and established precedents that would echo through military strategy for centuries to come. Most immediately, the battle ended the Teutonic Order's eastern expansion permanently. Never again would the Knights attempt to conquer Russian territories. The psychological impact of seeing their elite cavalry drowned en masse proved impossible to overcome. The Order redirected its efforts toward the Baltic regions, where they would continue their controversial campaigns of conquest and conversion. But the eastern door was permanently closed. For Alexander Nevsky personally, the victory secured his place in Russian history as one of the greatest military commanders of the medieval period. He would later become Grand Prince of Vladimir and continue to defend Russian territories against both Western and Mongol threats. The Orthodox Church canonized him in 1547, declaring him a saint for his defense of the faith against Catholic invaders. However, the controversial nature of his tactics at Lake Peipus was carefully managed in subsequent historical accounts. Russian chronicles emphasized the righteousness of the victory while downplaying the strategic deception involved. The image promoted was of divine intervention, God himself breaking the ice to swallow tea. He enemies of orthodoxy, rather than a carefully calculated use of environmental warfare. This sanitization of the historical record raises important questions about how we memorialize military victories. The battle on the ice became a foundational myth of Russian military prowess and orthodox resilience. Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 film Alexander Nevsky portrayed the battle as an heroic struggle against foreign aggression, with minimal attention to the horrific deaths by drowning. The Soviet state used the battle as propaganda, emphasizing Russian military genius and the defeat of German invaders, a parallel to their contemporary struggle against Nazi Germany. But beneath the patriotic narrative lies a more complex moral reality. Alexander Nevsky deliberately led an enemy army onto ice he knew would collapse, resulting in one of the most horrific mass casualties in medieval warfare. Does the justness of his cause, defending his homeland against invasion, excuse the method? Where is the line between tactical genius and war crime? Modern military ethicists have examined the battle on the ice as a case study in environmental warfare and the use of terrain as a weapon. Some argue that Alexander's strategy was no different than using any other natural feature, mountains, rivers, forests, to gain tactical advantage. Others contend that the deliberate use of terrain designed to cause mass drowning crosses into prohibited territory, even by medieval standards of warfare. The battle also influenced military thinking about cavalry tactics and the risks of overconfident pursuit. Military academies have studied Lake Peipus as an example of how hubris and failure to assess environmental conditions can turn victory into catastrophic defeat. The Teutonic Knights were so confident in their superiority and so eager to destroy a retreating enemy that they ignored basic reconnaissance about the terrain they were fighting on. Similar historical incidents emerged from the scholarly attention paid to Lake Peipus. Researchers discovered other battles where ice played a crucial role in determining outcomes. The Battle of Hamiros in 1311, where Catalan mercenaries defeated a much larger Byzantine force partly through the use of marshland that bogged down heavy cavalry. The Battle of Suzdal in 1445, where another frozen river became a trap for armored forces. The pattern suggests that Alexander's tactics, while particularly well executed, were part of a broader medieval understanding of using terrain to neutralize superior enemy forces. The environmental aspect of the battle also gained new relevance in modern times. Climate scientists studying Lake Peipus have used the historical record of the battle to understand medieval climate patterns. The fact that the lake was still substantially frozen in early April suggests colder spring temperatures than the region typically experiences today. This data contributes to our understanding of the medieval warm period and its transition into the Little Ice Age. Perhaps most significantly, The battle on the ice demonstrated the limitations of technological and tactical superiority when divorced from environmental awareness. The Teutonic Knights represented the cutting edge of medieval military technology, the best armor, the finest horses, the most rigorous training. Yet all of this meant nothing when the fundamental question, will the ground support our weight, went unasked or unanswered. This lesson has been repeatedly relearned throughout military history. From Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, where winter weather decimated his Grande Armée, to the Vietnam War, where sophisticated American military technology proved ineffective against an enemy who understood and exploited their local terrain and climate, the pattern endures. Environmental factors can neutralize even the most significant technological advantages. For the communities around Lake Peipus, the battle's legacy has been complicated. The site has become a tourist destination and historical monument, with memorials to Alexander Nevsky's victory. But local residents maintain a more ambivalent relationship with the lake and its history. Annual commemorations occur, but many older residents still express discomfort with the area where the drownings occurred. The mass gravesite, unmarked for centuries, was finally identified through archaeological research in the 20th century, but remains unexcavated out of respect for the dead and, perhaps, a lingering unease about what lies beneath. The battle also contributed to the centuries-long antagonism between Russian and Germanic peoples, feeding into nationalist narratives on both sides. Russian nationalism has frequently invoked Alexander Nevsky and Lake Peipus as symbols of resistance against Western aggression. Germanic and Baltic peoples have remembered it as an example of Russian treachery and cruelty. These competing historical memories have complicated diplomatic relations and contributed to ethnic tensions in the Baltic region that persist even today. What the battle on the ice ultimately reveals about human nature is deeply unsettling. It demonstrates our capacity for calculated violence, our willingness to use any means necessary when we believe our cause is just. Alexander Nevsky was defending his homeland, his people, and his faith against invaders who had already committed their own atrocities in the Baltic region. Yet the method he chose, deliberately drowning hundreds of men in freezing water, men who would die in terror and agony, forces us to confront the moral complexities of warfare. There is no simple lesson here, no comfortable conclusion. The battle was simultaneously a brilliant tactical victory, a necessary defense of Russian independence, and a mass casualty event involving calculated deception that resulted in one of the most horrific deaths imaginable. History is rarely as clean as we want it to be. The frozen waters of Lake Peipus hold secrets that ice and time can never fully preserve. What do you think? Was Alexander Nevsky a military genius who used every available advantage to defend his homeland? Or did his tactics cross a line that even medieval warfare should have respected? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you know of other historical battles where the environment itself became the deadliest weapon, share those stories with our community. The bodies of Teutonic Knights still rest beneath Lake Peipus. Divers occasionally report finding artifacts, pieces of armor, weapons, bones pressed into the sediment. The lake keeps its dead, a liquid tomb for men who rode to conquest and found only darkness beneath the ice. Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of medieval history, where the truth is always more terrifying than legend. Ring that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next dark mystery. See you in the next video.